Today's episode is brought to you by Create Engage, the digital marketing agency for the disruptive management consultancy. Digital marketing has moved forwards, but most consulting firms haven't. Many consulting firms still see their corporate blog as their sole digital marketing channel and find themselves frustrated when these blogs yield little, if any, results. For those consultancies that understand digital marketing, though, it can be a huge asset and help them achieve rapid business growth. In fact, at Create Engage, we've recently written a case study of one successful consulting firm that used digital marketing to help them grow over 400% in just 3 years. Having spent countless hours researching consulting firms and consulting leaders for this podcast, it became very clear that while some firms do digital marketing well, the vast majority of consulting firms struggle to leverage its power and don't know where to start. To help those of you who want to harness the power of digital marketing to grow your consulting business, but don't have the knowledge, capacity, or in-house capability to do so, I launched Create Engage, the first digital marketing agency for the management consulting industry. As former consultants ourselves, we understand the challenges that you face when it comes to delivering effective digital marketing that engages prospective clients and generates leads. Having worked in the industry, we understand consulting buyers, what resonates with them and what doesn't. This enables us to harness the latest in digital marketing in a way that aligns with your brand and your market positioning to attract the prospective clients that you're looking to target. We understand that each consultancy is unique and have a range of services to help you shape, implement, and sustain effective digital marketing strategies that deliver results, regardless of where you are on your digital marketing journey. If you would like to find out more about how Create Engage can help you use digital marketing to take your business to the next level, then send me an email at nick@createengage.co.uk or go to our website, createengage.co.uk, where you can download that free case study that breaks down the digital marketing strategies used by one successful consulting firm to help them grow over 400% in just 3 years and gives you the secrets they used so that you can apply them in your own firm. If you want to outpace your competitors and stand out in the crowded consulting market, then get in touch. We'd love to help you grow your business through digital marketing. Hi, and welcome to Climbing Consulting. In today's episode, I speak to David Stoddard, Chief Operating Officer at Barnett Waddingham, a leading independent professional services consultancy across risk, pensions, investment, and insurance, with a team of over 1,330 people across the UK. David has had an incredibly varied career, having worked with many of the big names in consulting, including Accenture, EY, and Baringa, the last of which where we first met on a project for one of David's life and pensions clients. Over the last 25 years, David has moved from consulting into industry and back again, and navigated multiple continents at the same time. It's this varied experience of successfully managing multiple career transitions that makes him a perfect guest for the show, and we go into each of these in today's episode. We cover a ton in this conversation and discuss a whole host of topics, including David's move from Accenture to Lloyds Banking Group and how he was able to successfully make the leap into industry and climb the career ladder, ultimately running their 3,000-person life and pensions operations function. Moving abroad, why David and his family chose to move to Australia, and his top tips for anyone thinking of making a similar leap. And David's advice on growing a consulting practice, whether you're doing so in a big established player or a startup consulting firm. It was great to catch up with David and learn more about his story, both from before when we worked together at Baringa and since. I learned so much that I didn't know, and there's some great practical advice in this conversation, both professional and personal. So if you are thinking of making the jump out into industry, or maybe you're considering whether you should move from a global firm to a boutique, I know that you are really going to enjoy this interview with David. So with all of that said, all that's left to say is sit back, relax, and enjoy today's conversation with David Stoddard. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Nick. Just a huge thank you for the invitation today. I've really actually enjoyed all your podcasts, and you've had some very inspirational and very interesting guests. So it's a great honor to be asked today by you.
Well, thank you for making the time, David. I know in today's lockdown world, everyone's incredibly busy, and it seems the days have only got busier now. You can go back to back on Zoom. So thank you for carving out the time, and really pleased to have a catch up. I think, we obviously knew each other a little bit from time back at Baringa, and really keen to dig into some of the things that I think are quite unique in your story. And I won't sort of steal that from you. I'll let you share. But maybe we start there, David. Why don't, just for my listeners who maybe don't know you so well, it'd be great to tee them up with that background on yourself and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, very happy to, Nick. So I'm currently the Chief Operating Officer of Barnett Waddingham, which is a leading independent UK professional services consultancy at the forefront of risk, pensions, investment and insurance. But prior to Barnett Waddingham, I think there's kind of three parts to my career. The first part is I started in consulting, like many of your guests at Anderson Consulting that became Accenture, and spent 8 happy years there. I then went into the insurance industry itself and spent 8 years leading very large operations for Lloyds TSB, which became Lloyds Banking Group, and then transitioned back to consulting for the last 8 years and had stints with 2 consultancies. Firstly, EY out in Sydney in Australia, where I led the startup of a team focused on business transformation. And secondly, Baringa Partners back here in the UK, which is a boutique consultancy who've got a fantastic brand presence in the energy market and financial services markets, and are expanding in many other areas as well. And I know you've had a couple of guests from Baringa on previously, so I'm sure your listeners will have heard of Baringa.
Brilliant. No, certainly have, David. And obviously, mentioned it a few times from my time there, thought very fondly of it. And like you say, it's incredible, the rate of growth. And you'll tell me more about sort of how you played a part in that. And like you say, I think those 3 chapters are going to be really interesting to dig into. Before we go on to that, though, and this is in part to the research that we do before, I'm always interested in things that crop up and just they're slightly out of the blue or different. And a couple of these relate to your younger life. So if actually this is sort of a period that you've closed, stop me, but particularly keen to understand, let's start with sort of your school days and actually your sporting approach. Because, I know you're still into your fitness now. You're a very keen sportsman back when you were younger. And actually, we're big into rowing and not just having a bit of fun doing it. You got to Henley and, you'll have to tell me how you did, but, you got to what is sort of the top of the top at school age rowing and beyond. And I'd just love to hear more about what impact that had for you. Why were you so focused on team sport when you were younger, and particularly looking towards when you moved on into the world of work? What were the sort of characteristics that taught you that you took forward? I know particularly for anyone listening with kids, I'm just fascinated what those sort of early years helped you do that really sort of stood with you as you went into your career and got you to where you are today.
Yeah, very happy to, Nick. And I feel kind of at this point, I might need to lie down on a couch or something if we're going that far back. But let me try and get the memory going and share some background for you. So I think just for context, my school was a highly academic school. And whilst I was bright, I was certainly nowhere near the cream of the crop. And indeed, I think there was actually a guy in my school who spoke fluent Latin, which, whilst not the most useful skill you might pick up these days, actually shows the kind of academic kind of proficiency of a lot of the people at the school. And as I say, I enjoyed school and I enjoyed the academic side, but equally, I really thrived on sport, as you say. And started off, doing rugby and all sorts of other things like lots of boys do when they're at school. But in the first year of the school, actually tried out rowing and just really loved it. Loved getting out at lunchtime onto the river. Loved being part of a team. There's 8 of us in the boat and having some good fun together, as well as working really hard. And I think, with the benefits of hindsight, which is always a beautiful thing, there's a few things which probably that rowing experience taught me. The first was around kind of strategic planning. Because if you think at the beginning of a season, which might be in November or December, you'd be making goals 8 or 9 months hence for the pinnacle of the season. And at that stage in your life, when you're 14, 15, 16, that's actually quite a long period of time. Secondly, I've mentioned the teamwork, and that's how do you get the best out of yourself, but equally, how do you work with others to bring the best out of them? Because in a rowing boat, you're only as fast as the 8 people in the team. There's also a kind of inner drive and determination, I think. And, that kind of drive to be better and to learn every day and to work out, okay, what are the things that are going well and you can improve upon, but equally, what are the things perhaps, you can do differently and what are the opportunities to get better? There's also that dedication of really sticking to something and that resilience which comes from dedication. And lastly, probably, Nick, the whole element of balance of life. How do you balance academic work and also your career with other interests that you might have outside of work. And I think, as we get busy throughout our careers, it's all too easy to perhaps lose some of that balance from time to time. And I guess it just taught me that, yes, you can balance it. And whilst it's hard getting up when it's dark in the winter mornings and getting to the weights room for 7 a.m. and then spending an hour and a half on the river in the evening when it's dark again, that it teaches you that actually you can do that and you can balance that with all your academics and everything else.
Yeah, I think, to that point, there was some really great lessons, that strategic planning. And you're quite right. When you're 15, 16, that school year is a lifetime. You think about the next summer as if it is a decade away. So I think some really key points in there. And I want to come on to your point on hobbies, because I know now you've still got hobbies that you're passionate about. And I think it's a really key part of balance. I guess I know you've obviously got a son who's probably that same age now. Is that the advice you give to him, of actually get out there, do your sport, get involved? And maybe for anyone listening, is that the sort of thing they should be helping their kids with? I guess maybe what advice would you give to anyone whose kids are thinking about sport, but maybe, they're trying to understand, will that impact the academics? Is that going to get them to university? Yeah. What would your take be?
I guess my advice to my son has always been to find something you're passionate about and something you enjoy, and to see sport as something you enjoy. And we've been really lucky, and I'm sure we'll touch on this later, that, he's always gone to a good school. He's always enjoyed his rugby as well. Although with kids getting a lot bigger now, he's 15. They're obviously not playing at the moment for very obvious reasons, but I don't know whether he'll carry on playing. It's funny, he actually this summer, it was his birthday in August. And I said to Max, what would you like to do for the day? And at the time I was on, getting ready to start at Barnett Waddingham. So I had some time off as well. And he said he'd been doing this rowing camp, actually, which was just something he'd enjoyed. And he said, Dad, would you like to come rowing with me? And at first I said yes. And then I kind of thought about it and thought, crikey, I literally haven't stepped into a rowing boat since I was 16, getting out the boat at Henley when we'd just come second in the final. And so it's quite a big psychological thing to say, actually, do I really want to do this? Because I could make a complete fool of myself. But with hindsight, actually, we went to the rowing club that he'd been in just on the river in near Chiswick Bridge, actually. And I jumped in the boat. And whilst I was a bit nervous, I have to say, actually, we had a lovely row for about an hour and a half up and down. It was a beautiful day, really still water, sunny, and it was just a fantastic experience. And when he went to that rowing camp, he asked me, Dad, what do you think I should be doing? What's your advice? And I said, just enjoy it. Just have fun. And I think sport should be fun, should be something people enjoy. And yes, if you're super talented and super passionate and you want to take it to that next level, then please, by all means do. I mean, when we were in Australia, Max had the chance of learning surfing on Bondi Beach, but he also did a lot of swimming because it's obviously a big sport there. And when we came back, he'd actually got to a county development squad, so he was really doing well. But he got to the point where, to be honest, he just didn't have the dedication for it. He was supposed to go 5 times a week. He was supposed to go on Friday evening, Saturday early morning. And at that point, we just said, well, look, if you're not enjoying it as much anymore, find something you do enjoy.
I think a really good point. And yeah, swimming and rowing are quite similar in that respect of the effort it requires. I was always a rugby player myself, and quite simply because the training to playing ratio was, for me, much better than rowing. I think the dedication I saw, particularly at university, my friends do for rowing, like you say, up in the mornings, early, evenings late. I certainly didn't have that. But I think to your point, just doing something you enjoy and until you stop enjoying it. And maybe moving towards more of, your life now. But you mentioned earlier, I think a really key point around actually keeping a hobby and doing something that keeps that work-life balance. And I know for you, your passion is soul music, and maybe we'll come on to your DJing past at some point in today. But, I think you said you've got something like 10,000 records. I mean, my first question, David, is how big a room do you need to fit those? But actually then, why is that such an important thing for you, particularly in, what you do now, but your career, that you talk through? You've always had very senior, high-pressure roles. A lot of people would think, well, you've not got time to go looking in the archives for records and sort of investigating that. Like, why has it been so important for you to keep that hobby? And then, how big is the room in the house to keep 10,000 records?
I think maybe just by way of context again, I mean, I got into music when I was quite young, actually. I used to play the drums I started off actually playing the violin. And then after about 6 months, I said to the violin teacher, I'm going to start learning drums. And she said, yeah, I think you'll be much better suited to that, was her feedback to me, which was good motivation, actually. But I started learning the drums and really got into it. I think I was about 6 or 7 at the time. And actually, we formed a little band when I was about 10, and
we're going way back here, David.
Oh, we're going way back. We toured to one of my friends' living rooms, I think, and played an end of day concert for our parents. But over the years, I really enjoyed playing drums and got reasonably good. Was in a couple of bands, but as part of that, I got quite into rock music initially. Bands like Led Zeppelin and Cream, because they're well known for their strong drummers who are some of the best, or regarded as some of the best in the world. But then one day I was actually working up in London. I used to work every summer holiday to earn some money, and I went to a record shop, so I used to buy records to drum along to at home. And I saw this record called Ultimate Breaks and Beats. And so I bought it, and it had some kind of James Brown on it, and it had some jazz funk, and it had a load of jazz stuff, and it was stuff I'd never really heard of, as well as some rock and just this whole variety of music. And I was like, crikey, this is A, really hard to drum to, but B, really, really lovely music. And so I went back to the record shop, the following week and bought another of this album. And it turns out that this is like one of the seminal sets of records for hip hop today. So about 80 or 90% of hip hop tunes, the drum beat behind them is based on this 30 odd record collection, really? Which is incredible, really. Yeah, it's incredible. So, but through that, I just got into a whole different world of music, particularly around funk and soul and jazz, as I say. And then just started getting curious about, okay, well, how do I find out more? And back in those days, of course, you didn't have the internet. You had to rely on magazines, you had to rely on word of mouth, but also hanging out at record fairs, going to record shops, quite specialist shops. And I was brought up in West London. There's lots of shops in West London and other parts of London, down in Brixton and other areas. And used to spend the weekends, going up to those record shops with my pocket money or the money I'd saved up when I was working the holidays and looking for something to buy. And it just kind of went from there. So that's kind of the background. In terms of the room, I mean, my records were in storage for quite some considerable time, I have to say. And with IKEA, it's quite easy to store things these days.
To that point, though, David, kind of, the point around when you were young and passionate about it, I get that. And, we all had those sort of things. For me, it was Pokemon cards. And I did just sell my collection. And anyone listening, or your son might be a little young for this, but they're worth quite a lot of money now. It's amazing what a little bit of card will go for on eBay. I guess the reason I flagged that is, what was it that kept you going with the records? Because, at some point we all get to a point where you get into work and suddenly, that takes priority. And hobbies can, drift away. I've spoken to tons of, particularly in consulting, where, you travel a lot. I've spoken to tons of people who just hobbies, fell away. I had this happen. I went on projects away from home and the rugby dropped off. And I think it's a really key thing in sort of that unique point we were talking about of you've kept going. When it would have been easier to sell the record collection and leave it, you put it in storage, got it in the house. Why have you kept doing it? And almost why is having that hobby and that break away from work so important to you?
To my mind, particularly in consulting, it is a full-on industry. And we all have periods in our time in any roles in consulting that are completely full-on and full gas, where you don't have as much time for the hobbies and the things you're passionate about. Equally, it's not an easy industry to operate in and can be quite taxing, both personally, professionally, and for you and a family. And so I think one of the skills from resilience to think about is how do you keep yourself grounded, and what are the things that keep you having a sense of balance and perspective? Because sometimes what it's like if you've got lots of projects on, you're in a really challenging client situation. Perhaps, you don't have all the people around you might want. You feel like your back's a bit against the wall. The question is, how do you pick yourself up, dust yourself off and start all over again, to quote Nat King Cole, I think. It is something you need to think about. And I think music for me has always been that thing that if I get up early in the morning and go for a walk, you can plug in your iPhone these days, your Walkman back in the day, and listen to some music, and you can just get carried away to a different place. And that just helps retain that sense of perspective on life and work.
I think that resilience point's a really powerful one. And like you say, I can't remember the name of the law, but it's, work will fill the time you allocate to it. And so if you give all of your, if you don't have something else to fill that time, it's easy to overwork and just, I'll do that last email. I think particularly right now when we're all stuck at home and frankly, we're running out of Netflix series to watch. So having that hobby that separates that, I think is really key. And like you say, gives you something that just you can break away and keeps you grounded, which is, I think a really critical point. 10,000 records, I'm still in awe of what that looks like, but maybe you can send me a picture after this, David. I'm keen to turn to actually sort of some of the big junctures in your consulting career? Because I think there's been a number of steps in your career when I was sort of, doing my research, when we were chatting, that I think are really interesting, and particularly for my listeners who are people who are on the journey that you've been on. And maybe we start with the sort of first jump, because that sort of move from senior manager into industry is something that you find, quite a few people do. They decide, actually, at this point in life, consulting isn't for me, I'm going to make a jump. But often they'll become the strategy manager or the operational improvement manager. And actually, it can almost be a place that their sort of career slows down, if I'm honest. And I think the thing that really struck me when we were talking is you made that transition into industry very successfully. You ultimately went on to lead the 3,000 person L&P ops business for LBG, which is no mean feat. But actually, if it's not too far a jump back, I'd love to understand more about that time for you, and particularly how you were able to make that transition, and almost looking back, what were some of those challenges and what's some of the advice you'd give to someone now thinking, I'm going to make a leap into industry and I want to make it as successful as possible?
Yeah, absolutely, Nick. And I think maybe if I set some context first, just for your listeners, at the time, as you say, I was a senior manager at Accenture. I'd had kind of 8 years experience at Accenture, done some fabulous projects. So I'd begun to develop a specialism in insurance, but very much on the kind of change management side of things. In other words, target operating models and leading teams to deliver operational effectiveness, operational efficiency. And those have been the experiences I'd enjoyed most in my latter career at Accenture. And I think from that, I developed a kind of yearning to understand a little bit more about my clients and how they thought. And I always thought at the time, as a plucky young consultant, actually, why isn't my project the thing that's top of my client's agenda? Yet they seem to be distracted with all these other things, and they've said it's their top priority, but then they spend all this time, 90% of their time doing all this other stuff. So why is that? So perhaps a bit of naivety on my point at that point in my career. But equally, from a life perspective, we also wanted to settle down and start a family. And so a transition to an industry role made sense. I was quite thoughtful, though. And like you say, Nick, lots of people in consultancies, I think, become quite specialist quite early on in their career. And I'd always tried my best to retain as much generalism, whilst having a couple of strengths and a couple of spikes where I was kind of deeper, but to try and retain that sense of generalism, to not cut off any options. And I think that point of variety has always been a kind of constant and a theme throughout my career. In terms of the transition itself, I mean, I have to say it was a massive learning curve. I went from leading a team of about 30 Accenture people and clients to leading a team of about 700 or 800 customer-facing people who were highly passionate, highly driven. We were going through quite a large claims transformation at the time. And I was looking after all of the customer services in Lloyd's general insurance business, which included claims. I remember the first flood event was certainly a huge learning for me. But taking a step back and probably, with the benefits of hindsight, there were a few things that stuck out as probably key learnings for me. I think firstly, I had some great help and support. So I had some really supportive colleagues, some really stretching mentors, but equally did have some great external coaching support as well. And I think, wherever you are in your career, always think of who are the people who can help and advise me? Who are those gurus, those mentors, those people who can challenge you, who can support you, who can inspire you, and who can actually sometimes just help you to think about things slightly differently. I think secondly, the second big learning was around what I'd call leadership pipeline. And what I mean by that, it's actually a book, which I was digging out actually, because I know you sometimes ask your guests about books. We might come on to that later.
We will come on to that later, definitely.
Okay, I'll look forward to that. So, but just as a precursor to that, there's a book called The Leadership Pipeline. And what this describes is throughout your career, you go through different leadership transitions. You start off managing yourself. So if you think of yourself as an analyst or someone brand new to consulting, it's all about you managing yourself and actually, doing great work and being passionate and driven and producing good quality work and being part of the team, but actually your performance is more judged on you. You then get to the point where you manage others. And actually that's about unlearning some of the things which have made you successful in the past, which is quite a hard skill to do, but then relearning new skills in terms of how do you bring the best out in others. You then move on to managing managers, which is actually where you've got maybe one or two layers of of management and leadership, where you can't directly control the team because you've got to work through your managers. So the question is, again, what are those new supplementary skills you've got to learn? And then when you lead a function, you actually get up to functional leadership, and beyond that, it's business leadership. But the book just describes really succinctly that transition. I thought that was a really key kind of learning for me.
I'm going to hold on that if you don't mind, David, because I think
of course,
it's fascinating in itself. And I really like the way you describe it of sort of analyst, you're managing yourself. And then as you go up to manage people, you unlearn some things and learn some things. And maybe with that frame, what are some of those key things? Take it yourself or some of the people you've mentored now, you're at the other end of that journey of what are some of those key skills you have to learn and unlearn at each stage? What is it that the analyst going up to a people manager unlearns? And then as they need to learn to get to the next stage as you go on.
As I say, when you're an analyst, as an example, what makes you successful is the quality of your personal work. Yes, of course, you need to be a good team player and all of those types of things, but actually your performance typically is judged by the quality of your individual work. And I think, so for lots of people, success and fear are quite closely related. And when you transition to managing others, actually you have to let go of the thing that has made you successful, because otherwise you're stifling your team member. And what I see is, particularly when I coach and mentor people who are earlier on in their career, one of the things I think some people struggle with is releasing and letting go, yet putting the checks and balances around, in other words, coaching in the right way to provide not only challenge but support, but equally to give people the free space to make mistakes and learn, because we've all made mistakes throughout our career. But how do you do that when your performance is judged on someone who's working for you? And it's that first transition is really quite hard. I think that second transition then, when you move from managing others to managing managers, you've then got to think really long and hard about how do I make sure I build the right leadership capability in my team? In other words, how do I recruit and develop the people with the same values as me, the same drive as me, the same aspirations as me? But equally, how do I recruit people who compensate for some of my personal weaknesses? And how do I actually bring people into the team who aren't just mirrors of me, because otherwise then it'll be a boring place to operate and will be totally undiverse and just not very exciting. But actually you'll be much stronger when you have people who can perhaps pick up the things which you're not so great at, because none of us are perfect at everything. And then when you go on to functional leadership, that's a whole new dimension where you start to take on, actually, whilst you're of course focused on your function and that side of things, you're actually thinking about the broader business and all the other functions in the business. So for instance, when I was leading the customer service team, it's surprising. You kind of think to yourself, well, could a person in that situation actually just be a real specialist in customer service? Well, potentially as a kind of head of, but actually once you get to functional leadership, you're much more into, you're part of the team now running a business, and you need to have good skills in risk, in compliance, in HR, in finance, in marketing, in sales. You need to be able to contribute to that running the overall business. And that's probably another key transition to work through, is how do you gain that real breadth and be competent enough in that very diverse set of areas, yet equally specialist enough in your own area, so that you have that right balance of functional and business leadership.
I think some great points in there, David. And I think something that really stuck with me, as you went through that hierarchy, if you like, is that transition from, almost managing time, and particularly your time, to going on to leading teams, leading people, particularly as you go up those sort of functional steps. And I'd be really interested, actually, you've sat both sides of the fence, is how does that almost evolution change on the consulting side versus the industry side? Is it the same steps? Is it different steps? And where do you see some of the challenges people find in making that jump from consulting into that hierarchy in an industry role?
I think firstly, as consultants, we're all quite proud, aren't we? And I think the point I made earlier around not being shy to ask for help and not being shy to put the right support around you is really quite a big step to take. I think possibly that the second piece is thinking about the breadth of your role. So being really thoughtful. And you mentioned earlier that potentially some of the people you'd had exposure to transition to industry roles, and perhaps you felt their careers had stalled slightly. I think perhaps they went into niche roles.
You're making me feel terrible now.
No.
I feel like I've been insulting people there. That wasn't the intention.
No, not at all. And I wasn't trying to insinuate that. That's just what I heard. But perhaps people specialize a little bit too soon and didn't necessarily think through that breadth point that I made around how do you build that breadth. I think, though, probably the key biggest learning for me, particularly in that first 6 to 12 months at Lloyd's, was around self-awareness and actually understanding yourself. Because if you don't understand yourself and your innate drivers and your innate values, it's going to be really hard to lead other people. And possibly the last one, which there's maybe a small anecdote I can share as well, is around communications. And what I mean by that is, as consultants, we tend to develop our own language. And we've all played a consulting buzzword bingo from time to time, haven't we? But we do develop our own language. The number of TLAs, or three-letter acronyms, that we constantly invent makes it quite impenetrable, actually, to people transitioning the other way round from industry back into consulting. But also at times makes it hard for clients to understand us. And I remember probably the biggest lesson I had on this was I was probably about 6 or 9 months into my first role at Lloyd's. And every year we used to hold frontline colleague events where, in groups of between 50 and 100, all of the frontline members of my team would go off site. And this year it's actually being held in a marquee out the back of our office in South Wales. And at the time, as I mentioned earlier, we were going through a claims transformation in our GI business, which I was leading. And I think one of the team asked me this quite straightforward question around, okay, so we're going through this change, and what does that mean for roles? And I remember I just instinctively answered as a consultant. So I talked about operating models and differentiation from our competitors, and the kind of strategic capabilities we're trying to build, and the synergies between different types, and the outcomes and benefits we're aiming for. And I remember she looked at me at the end and said, listen, I think you're a nice guy, so I'm going to kind of trust you, but I didn't understand a word you said. And that just brought home to me that point around communications. And actually, learning plain English is a really good skill, particularly in industry roles. And just making sure you're always thoughtful about that in your interactions with clients as well.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who runs a marketing agency for consulting firms, David, I spend a lot of my day explaining that to consultants is the word operating model rarely means anything in client organizations, and particularly, like you say, on the front line. And there's a lot of actual research on this. Particularly, you look at the presidential election that's just gone, for instance. If you look back at all of the presidential elections to date, the winning candidate for something like the last 100 years is the one who spoke in the simplest language, because it appeals to the most people. And also, I guess, to your point, consultants in industry can sometimes have not a bad reputation, but they're seen as consultants, and if you want to fit in, you need to speak in the way that your colleagues in the company you're working in do, not in the consultant speak, because it'll signpost that you're not one of them, so to speak. Which is, I guess, to your point, if you're trying to bed into a new business as so in a line role, you really don't want to stand out as the former consultant. You want to stand out as the the new person in the company who's part of that culture, I guess.
Absolutely, and I think if you fast forward a few years from there, and perhaps, reflecting back on the time at EY, which we might come to shortly, I just remember that whole point, the point I mentioned on breadth. So how do you become a technical specialist in something, because that's what a client's ultimately paying for, yet have enough breadth to be credible at a really senior level? I mean, that point was really brought home to me when we went to see a global multinational insurer, and actually their head office in Sydney. I don't want to say any names, of course. But we actually went to see the chief legal counsel, a great client called Peter, excellent guy. And we actually worked with him for a couple of years. But I remember it was the first meeting with him, and we went in to talk actually about legal operating models, funnily enough, and global legal transformation, and how you kind of think that through. And I remember before we got started, and of course, like diligent consultants, we produced some slides and a great story. He said, David, I'm really pleased you're here, because I've been talking to my colleague in London, and I just want you to explain to me about the FCA and the PRA and their stance on matters X, Y, and Z. And the client's perception was, well, here we've got a partner from EY. I expect him to know this stuff. And I think that's probably the best consultants. When I was a client, going back to being a client, was the best consultants could talk enough about a wide range of topics, but equally knew when to phone a friend. Whereas I think some of the most frustrating meetings was where people couldn't answer anything apart from the one really spiky topic that they were thinking about, and didn't have that breadth. So I think that breadth point is really, really important to think about in your career. And I think that's always a choice for consultants, is specialism versus generalism. But just think of, it's easy to specialize, I think, a little bit too early perhaps in your career. Think about what's the long game here, where am I really trying to get to, and how do I balance that specialism and generalism?
I think a really good anecdote, David. I think great advice. Yeah, and I say that maybe you're preaching to the choir or the converted here. I'm like you. I'm a generalist who probably I've never been good enough at anything to specialize, but like you find those benefits of generalization, and time again when I speak to guests for this show and others in my network, that point comes out. Is your clients, one of my previous guests talked about the T-shaped consultant, the sort of a bit about everything, and then you've got your sort of deep vertical as well. I'm interested to come on to your point around how you progress in industry, and I think having done it on both sides of the fence, you will have quite a unique perspective on this. Of personally, and I speak for myself here because I don't want any listeners to be offended, is when I was working in consulting, the thing that I liked about it is the career path was very simple in terms of structure. Is the steps were all laid out, and provided you did everything at each step, you knew if you did this, you'd get to manager, senior manager, etc., up to partner. And I think the thing that always, when I looked at industry, and I know I'm not, I doubt I'm alone in this, it always seemed like just a maze. How do you? There's no clear career path. Now I have friends in industry now, and sort of I just don't understand it. I don't get how you go from the shop floor to the top office, or however you navigate in between. And you've done it. You went in at managing 700 people, you went to the top of the operations function managing 3,000. I'd love to understand how that sort of industry progression is different from consulting. And to your point around advice for people who have made that move, what is that advice? What should people be doing differently to successfully navigate industry progression that maybe is not the same as what they do to navigate progression in a consulting firm?
I think it's a great question, Nick. And again, I think there are some similarities between consulting and industry, but equally some important differences. So the similarities are, I think the career structure is within functions in different client organizations. So for instance, take the operations function or the HR function or the finance function. I think there's generally a sense of structure and a sense of hierarchy. The big difference, though, of course, is consultancies, so long as they're growing, have the capacity to promote people at certain points in their career. Whereas actually in client organizations, that's not always the case, because you have a org chart. And again, unless you're growing or doing something different, like perhaps running a change program or creating a new function or creating a new capability or a new competence, you don't necessarily have that same capacity. In other words, that same ability to promote people. So that's probably one important difference. And I think possibly the thing to think about then is actually not to only think about linear routes in the organization, but to think about what are some of those skills and those capabilities that I've got, but equally the things I'm really passionate about and enjoy, because that is probably the most important thing, is making sure you're doing something you're passionate and you enjoy, because you'll throw your whole self into it. But thinking, okay, so I might be, for instance, the head of customer service right now, but what are the key competencies and skills I've got? And actually, where else could they be applicable in the organization? And how can I create opportunities? I mean, you can't create something necessarily from scratch, but again, think a bit laterally, think about what are the big change programs? What's on the ExCo's agenda, and what are some of those opportunities that might be coming up? And how could I create something, perhaps something new? The other dynamic to think about in client organizations, and take Lloyds as an example, is Lloyds Banking Group is obviously a large universal bank. They have a commercial banking operation, they've got a personal banking operation, they've got a mortgages business. At the time, they had some international divisions, although they've scaled that back. There are, a lot of internal functions. So there's a lot of parts to the group. And I think that's the other thing to think about, is don't just think about your business, think about your entire group and the entire universe. And that will give you lots more optionality. And I think that's the thing I'm alluding to, Nick, is probably just in summary, create options for yourself rather than just one route. Because one route is going to be very binary in terms of outcomes. Whereas actually, if you create optionality, that will give you some choices, but it equally will make you think very differently about your development. What are the things I'm really good at? How could I apply those? But equally, what are some of the things I need to learn if I think about some of those career choices in the future? And then it's back to probably good old-fashioned networking at the end of the day, is staying really in touch with people, not only in your part of the business, but equally all those other parts of the business. So I hope that's kind of answered your question.
Yeah, it does, David. And, I think your point on actually they're not as different as maybe, particularly me as a host of a show like this tries to make out. And I think your point, just it dawned on me, but it's probably obvious to you and many of our listeners, is just like in consulting, you climb in part through your business development, your networking, and bringing business in through those contacts. I think what I'm hearing from yourself is you need to take a similar approach to an internal, a line role in a big organization, actually network with the people across the business, look at those different options. And I think, like you say, that critical point of don't close off options too early, particularly in today's world where, things like data science didn't exist 5 years ago. And, it's the hottest thing in most organizations right now. You need to keep yourself open to these opportunities because those are some of those growing areas you can capitalize on. I think that, really good advice. And yeah, maybe they're not quite as different as I thought they were, back when I was working in consulting. I want to now turn to, you touched on EY, and I want to turn to, that part of your life. But I think, again, and some of this might just be, my judgments, but I'm sure some of my listeners are thinking, typically in today's world, everything's simplified. And you think that, look, you get to the top of a business and you stay there. You made it to the top of operations in LBG, got 3,000 people. Most people, some people just think, well, David, that's your life set, stay there, go to the golf club, whatever the metaphor is. But you obviously decided to make a big jump. And at the same time, you left that to go back into consulting, and you left UK entirely and went over to Australia. That if it was one little, some people do one jump. I rarely hear of people doing two. And I'd love to just get, again, looking back at that time, what led to that? Why did you decide it was the time to make a move? And particularly, how did you come to that decision? Do you remember any of the questions you asked yourself, you discussed with your wife or your mentors? Because it's such a big decision, both moving, what do they say, sort of the big life decisions are getting married, moving job and moving house. And you did two of those and we'll give you a bonus for moving country. Like that's a big, big decision. How did you decide it was right for you? And then what questions did you ask to make sure it was the right decision for you and your family?
Great question once again, Nick. So thank you. You certainly give me a good workout this morning, that's for sure. So I think thinking back, and it's probably, again, perhaps helpful to share some context. So I'd been at Lloyd's at this point by 8 years, and as you say, gone on to some really big roles. But this was during the global financial crisis, and it was during the time when banks in particular were under quite a lot of scrutiny. They'd gone into part public ownership. And I remember one Sunday lunch where we had some friends around at our house and we were talking about banks, and the husband suddenly started ranting about banks and bankers. And I was kind of thinking, hold on a sec, you're right round at our house having Sunday lunch. Let's just relax.
So it's a little awkward for a Sunday lunch, isn't it?
It was, but that was the general mood. And the regulatory scrutiny which came on off the back of that wasn't quite intense. So it'd been a really great 8 years, lots to be super duper proud of, but felt like the right time for a move. And I think what I thought about first was, well, what is it I'm looking for? And I think I really just missed that variety of consulting, the opportunity to work at an industry level, not just within one firm, the opportunity to make a real difference across a range of clients, and the opportunity to work with, super bright, talented people. That's not to say you don't get super talented people in industry, but you generally, consultancies do attract the kind of, to some extent, the cream of the crop. So I think that was part of the driver. And then we started thinking about, okay, perhaps a return to consulting. And I did phone up some friends actually who obviously moved on to EY and a range of other consultancies, and started sounding them out about a return to consulting. And I remember EY, a couple of the companies actually were like, great, David, love to have you back. Your industry experience would be fantastic. We can see setting up a COO type function and perhaps an operational transformation type function. And I said, well, that's fantastic, but actually I'd love to, but actually equally want to get as a family some international experience at the same time. And what we thought about was, what are some of the places in the world that have a great opportunity to work, but equally somewhere you could see we could have a good life as well. So where would my wife be happy? Where would we be happy as a family? My son was 7 at the time, and we wanted to make sure he had a good experience for his life as well. So those were some of the quite practical questions we asked ourselves.
I've got to ask on that, David, because I love practical on this show. And as much as you're willing to share, I'd love to just know those criteria that you benchmark on. Was it good weather, good climate? What were the criteria and what was the shortlist?
We basically thought about, well, let's anchor on a few different things. Let's anchor on the role. And we thought if we are going to make a move, certainly it needs to be to a company like to take EY as a brilliant example, with a fantastic brand in its local market. Because as an individual, you won't have any personal brand. You'll be leveraging the brand of that company coming in. A company with great clients, great network. So those were some of the kind of market dynamics, if you like. It was also I always think with consulting, you need to think about what's the opportunity, what's the need I'm coming in to fulfill, particularly at a partner type level. And in the case of EY in Sydney, it was serendipitous because they were looking for someone to help start their kind of operational transformation, business transformation practice, which didn't exist. So even though I was new to the market, actually I knew that other partners were really close to the market. EY always had a fantastic brand presence, a whole host of great clients right across financial services and insurance. But I brought perhaps that expertise in business transformation, some of the industry focus, and also stories from the UK. So stories across geographies, as you know, in any consulting business are really relevant. And I think the Australia look to the UK in terms of, you know, some of the questions for us as a family. I mean, for us to think about as a family was around Max's education, just thinking very practically, thinking about, yes, the weather does play an important part because, you know, you can spend 10 months of the year on a beach and having a nice time at the weekends, and that's a great experience to have, but also one where, you know, language wouldn't necessarily be an immediate barrier for us. So that's one thing to think about as well. And also culturally, do we feel we can fit in? I mean, much like a question you'd ask yourself about any organization, you need to think about that on a kind of cultural level at a national level as well. And, you know, I've been lucky enough throughout my career to work in many different countries with many different people from different backgrounds, different experiences. And I think that richness, that diversity, I think was also something to consider is, will it bring, you know, an element of diversity and another interesting experience to build on. So those are some of the kind of practical considerations as well.
I really like those, and I don't think anyone would begrudge you wanting to go somewhere where the temperatures are warmer and you can spend your weekends on the beach and having barbecues, particularly as we record this in the depths of winter in the UK. And to that point, you know, you said you wanted to get some international experience, just something, you know, some life experience. What was it that gave you? Again, you know, having had guests on here who've done similar and equally, you know, spoken to people in my network who ummed and ahed, you know, should I go, shouldn't I go? For anyone who's on the fence, what are the things for you that actually, you know, that experience of just working and living in another country really gave you, and, you know, you would encourage people who might be on the fence to go and get and sort of make that leap? What were those key things for you?
There's a whole host, actually, Nick, and some personal and some obviously career and professionally focused. I mean, by way of context, my mum's Turkish, and I was brought up, you know, by my mum and my dad, spending a long time in the summer holidays, you know, up to 2 months, sleeping on the floors with my relatives in small flats in Ankara, the capital of Turkey, and listening to the mosques calling people to prayer, and normally stiflingly hot. We didn't have air conditioning, so the windows were obviously open, and normally in the background there was a poorly dubbed version of Dallas or Dynasty or some other American show. But I guess that was my upbringing, and I was just used to diversity. It's never been a thing that's been kind of different, or it's actually been something throughout my life. We've always, as a family and as a person, been intrigued and interested by people from different backgrounds, different experiences, because I think it just makes the world such a richer place. So there was that kind of innate drive to experience something new, and particularly I've always found Asia Pacific as a place absolutely fantastic. And Sydney, I think, was a good hub into Asia Pacific. So I did have the opportunity, which was fantastic, to work in Hong Kong, in Singapore, the Philippines, and a number of other places as well. And so I think it just gave that cross-cultural experience of working much more consciously with different nationalities, different cultures, different experiences. And I remember I ended up leading some quite big global transformations, where one of those, I had a team in Sydney, we had a team in Hong Kong, we had a team in New York, a team in London, all simultaneously working, which is not great for sleep, frankly.
Oh, sorry, on the same time zone. So not as in their time zones, as in like 9 to 5 was
No.
universal across the
Everyone was in
teams.
their own time zone. So what that meant is being in Sydney is you'd always be up first thing in the morning and last thing at night on calls, because you'd get it either end of the day. But I think just having that really rich cross-cultural opportunity to work with different people from different experiences was just fantastic. And to live in a different environment for my son, a different educational system, a different group of friends than he'd have met, a different set of experiences, was fantastic for him. And as a family, we're just really lucky. We met loads of welcoming, warm, really friendly people who really embraced us as a family, and we had a great experience.
Yeah, I think a great story, and for anyone who's listening, I think just reassures them because sadly right now we can't go anywhere, be it in the UK or outside. But like you say, the things you gain from that diversity. I mean, my wife and I, we went as far as London, but we're very fortunate in this country that we have one of the most diverse capital cities in the world, and just that breadth of different cultures and people is so important. And like you say, actually going abroad lets you see that and appreciate it. And I imagine you mentioned on that program where you were running sort of globally, I mean, equally, did you find, to your point around breadth earlier, did you find that having worked, in, I think you mentioned Hong Kong, but worked in Asia, worked in sort of Australia and the UK, actually, was it easier to manage sort of global programs of that scale when you've got that cultural understanding of what those countries are like and the people there are like? Is that another thing that you found sort of made those programs easier for you?
I think so, but you always learn. I mean, culture is such a rich thing, and there's so many facets to culture that you're always learning and you're always finding out new things. I mean, again, I might be trailing a book here, but one of the books I think I actually first read at university, but equally I think has been one I returned to quite a bit over the years, is a book by a guy called Gert Hofstede, which is called Cultures and Organizations. And I think why this book's interesting is Hofstede, I think he was from the Netherlands originally, and he did, I think it was back in the 70s, a cross-cultural survey where he looked to map different cultures on different dimensions. And he produced some very nice consulting 2x2 matrices where you could compare different cultures. And I know there is a risk, of course, with any mapping of cultures, of stereotyping and all sorts of other things that you want to avoid. But equally, it gave a bit of science and a bit of richness to understanding, at least at a kind of starting point, understanding different national cultures and why they might be different, because it got beneath the skin in terms of not just it's different because of A and B, it's actually what are the deep innate beliefs and values that people within those cultures hold, and how does that therefore shape their behaviors? And I think that was a really interesting book. So to take one of those examples, one of the dimensions was masculinity versus femininity. And he described some of those more masculine cultures where it's kind of macho wacho, up or out, got to stay working late beyond the time of my boss, etc. And then some of those more feminine cultures, which perhaps are more caring, more meritocratic in many ways. For instance, some of the Scandinavian countries. And you'll see that right through the health system and through, I lived in Copenhagen for 6 months, and generally there's a lot less hierarchy, a lot less distance between people, and equally the wealth is shared much more widely in those cultures. And I think that's just really interesting as one dimension. Again, it's one survey and one data point, but it at least, for me, has given me a very basic first grounding. But then, of course, when you throw yourself into a new culture, you learn all sorts of things, as you always do.
Yeah, I love the book recommendation, and I'll share all the links and the recommendations on the show notes with my listeners. But I'll also get a copy for that myself, David, because I think it's a really strong point. And almost to what we were talking about before around organizational culture, that 2x2 matrix could be applied equally to the difference between England and Australia as it could between the difference between, I guess, LBG and EY. And actually understanding all of those cultural traits is critical at a cultural, a country level, but equally every organization is its own nation state, its own microcosm, and actually understanding some of those differences can be really critical to navigating and sensitively sort of working with people in those places. So I think it's a great recommendation. Yeah, I'm definitely going to look it up. And maybe this is a sort of similar theme to the one we talked about going out to Australia. And I want to a bit later on talk more about, I guess, your time at EY, and we'll come on to Baringa as well, around actually how you build practices, because obviously it was something you did successfully at both of those consultancies, albeit they were different types of firms. But I think equally, the point I made around jumping from senior industry to senior consulting is a big step. Again, the other sort of, maybe I call it a cliche, is once you make partner, again, similar to making sort of top of a firm, you stay. And I think for yourself, actually, this is now your third senior leadership role in a consulting firm as a partner. And I'd love to just sort of get your take around actually how do you approach your career in that respect? What is it for you that you look for at each of those stages, and how do you decide when it's right to be looking to make a move? Is it something that you have, a career plan? Is it something you have sort of a personal philosophy about how long you want to be in any role? What is it for you that you look for to decide if actually it's the right time to be making that next jump?
I think what I'd say is possibly those transitions you've mentioned have been more circumstantial than by design. And what I mean by that was, obviously, we described earlier some of the drivers for the experience in Sydney and with EY. And during the 3 years we were there, I grew the team from one person that was me, so it's pretty lonely at the start, particularly on work nights out, to 35 people. We worked with a whole range of clients in the area we specialised. We recruited some fantastic people and delivered some great client projects. But I think in building in a new startup, actually, when you're in a startup situation, you need to think of what are the phases of building a business. And I think that kind of 0 to 3 to 4 years is a really key phase, because actually that's where you go from not perhaps having done as much in that space to actually critical mass. And a point where actually at that point you've reached critical mass, you then need to think about, okay, what's that next transition, which is probably to double again in another 4 or 5 years. So that was a logical point, a logical stepping off point career-wise. But from a family point of view, we'd been in Australia for 3 or 4 years. We'd had a fantastic experience, but we actually really wanted our son's education to continue back here in the UK. And we learned that when we went to see some schools actually out in Sydney, where you can imagine the scene. We went to see these fantastic schools, these beautiful playing grounds, all these healthy, happy-looking kids walking around, tanned with, great white teeth, and these playing fields overlooking the harbour, and the facilities were just out of this world. We got home one night and probably cooked a barbecue, and my wife and I, popped open a bottle of Aussie Shiraz or something like that, and we were just talking about, is this actually what we really want? I think at that moment we realised actually we were just slipping into making a decision, if you like, through the back door. I think though, so that was the circumstance for EY. And I think the Baringa opportunity, once we decided to come back to the UK, Baringa was a company I'd been in contact with since the late Lloyd's days, actually. So, and had been considering a potential move to Baringa, as we both said earlier, we've both got a shared history there, fantastic growth story. But it just so happened that once again, there was one of those serendipitous moments where we suddenly thought, actually, is it the right time to come back? And at the same time, Baringa were looking to build up a life and pensions business. And whilst Baringa had done loads of things really fantastically well and had a quite large and significant insurance business that was largely based on the general insurance and London market side of things, and perhaps hadn't done as much work in the life and pension space, and so they were looking for an experienced leader to come in and build up that part of the business. And again, because that was a startup, albeit under different circumstances, which we can touch on, it was growing something without a known brand. But that felt like a good serendipitous opportunity where personal desire and business need matched. And I think in consulting firms, that's really, really important, particularly when you get more senior in the organization, is how does my personal desire plus the needs of the business and the organization, how do they match or not? Because if they do, then there's an opportunity there. If they don't, then there's a slight mismatch. So I think that was the reason for the move to Baringa. And I think, as I say, 4 years hence, worked with many of the most well-known life and pensions businesses, delivered some great client worked with some really nice niche and specialist businesses in the life and pensions markets, as well as some of the suppliers to the life and pensions industry. So really great story. But one of the lessons I learned at Lloyd's early on was always recruit a successor nice and early. And we managed to recruit a fabulous leader who will now take that part of the business to the next level and will no doubt do fantastic things and build on all that kind of early startup success with that next transition to, okay, how do we now scale this and how do we do more client work and add more value to our clients?
I think some great points, David, and we'll come on to the brand building because I think there's a really interesting piece in there and also on that startup culture piece. I guess just interested, that latest move that you've made is obviously more, as you said earlier, you're now COO, you're back on, I guess you'd call it the operational side of the business. What was it that led you to decide actually that's now the right, you'd just done two of those sort of startup build roles. How did you decide that this was the time for that change? Was it like you mentioned, with the Baringa opportunity, actually it was sort of fortuitous and chance and the timing worked? Was it a sort of career planning piece? How did you decide actually, now's the time to go from that practice lead where you've built the practice onto more of that sort of senior operations side?
It was kind of a bit of both, actually, if truth be told. I think the first thing was, as I say, I'd done 3-4 years at Baringa and we'd been very successful and done lots of things really, really well. We'd built up the team. And so I think the next consideration was, okay, what is that next 3 to 4 year stage of the journey? And in my heart of hearts, am I really up for that? So that's quite a personal reflection. I think, though, more broadly, though, and probably more importantly, it was a fortuitous connection of becoming linked with Barnett Waddingham. And I had for some time actually thought about some of the times I had at Lloyd's with some of my fondest memories of being in that much broader, larger leadership role. I had really started to think about, okay, under what conditions would it be that I'd like to perhaps give another leadership role a go? And the opportunity came up at Barnett Waddingham, and it really was like the stars had kind of completely aligned, because we've got a fabulous culture who put clients and people first, and that very much gels with my own values. The business is very successful, and we've grown successfully for the last 31 years, and we've developed loads of new services. So that felt like good. It's always good to join a consulting business that's successful. The deep specialisms are in the pension space and investments and other areas which I'm really familiar with. And it was back to that leadership role, yet within professional services and consultancy. So it was almost like the stars had completely aligned. What really swung it for me, Nick, was the more I just talked to the people at Barnett Waddingham, I just thought, wow, you've been so successful, yet we've got that opportunity to help take this to the next level and to build on that growth story. And the people, were inspiring, were challenging, were very supportive, very friendly, very open. And I think that's what swung it for me, really, was the culture, the people, and the fact that actually it's just a great fun place. So, as I say, we do the right thing by clients and colleagues. We're in it for the long term. We're constantly investing for the future. There's a kind of continuous improvement culture, great teamwork, but individual excellence is expected, and it's fun. So you put all of that together and you kind of think, well, it's almost like a bit like the perfect package, but like, wow, someone almost designed this for me, even though they didn't, by the way, I have to say.
Sounds like a good mix, David. And to your point, it gives you that opportunity to do, have that broader role like you enjoyed at LBG. I guess maybe, and this will move us towards that brand building piece, but almost at the start of that journey, as anyone who's listening to this is probably thinking, oh, I like the sound of, you talked about your time in Australia and at Baringa, that sort of passion and the drive and that startup culture. And maybe before we go on to actually how you did that, I'd kind of love to close off this piece by actually just getting your advice for anyone who was where you were either at LBG or, could have been someone in a bigger consulting firm. They might be a partner in a large practice at a big four and thinking, well, I kind of fancy trying this. Almost, what would you say are those key skills they need to just look at sort of internally and make sure they have, or questions they need to ask themselves? What are those questions that will help someone decide, actually, I should go and I am the right person to go and do a startup consulting practice, or actually maybe I'm better off in an established one? How should people think about that to help them make that right choice if that opportunity presents?
I think there's a few things that you need to really carefully consider if you want to do a startup. And I remember there was someone, one of my mentors I mentioned earlier in my career, said, in a consulting business, you should only ever do in your whole career one startup. And I managed to do 2 in 8 years, which some might say is foolish, others might say is great. I think there's a few different things which are important. I think first, you need to really understand the company culture you're joining. Is it the right environment that's going to support growth? Are you going to have the right support, the right challenge, and the right things which help fund growth? And that might be client relationships, it might be a brand, it might be networks, it might be just that entrepreneurial spirit, it might be that kind of youth and vitality. It can be a whole host of factors. So what are the contextual things that are going to help you? Secondly, consider the startup in terms of what's it actually really trying to do, and do I have the right skills to be able to do that and add value to that? Thirdly, I think there's a whole piece about business building. And what I mean by that is, how do you set a plan and a strategy for your area, yet start to create quick wins and some momentum quite quickly? Because you can only rely on a strategy or a plan for so long. You actually need to start getting some runs on the board, to use a consulting phrase. And equally, think about your own personal drive, determination, and resilience. How are you going to, because it's not easy starting new bits of businesses within a consulting environment or anywhere else. It does require some tenacity, some drive, some determination, some grit, particularly in the early days where perhaps, you don't have the right people with the right skills around you because you haven't had the chance to recruit them yet. You perhaps don't have all of the credentials you might ideally want. You may not have all the relationships you want. So how do you get through that? How do you, start to work with a client, do that first piece of work, off the back of that, perhaps do a second piece of work, build those relationships, broaden out, recruit some people back in behind? How do you get that whole juggling act working? So those are some of the things to think about. So some quite personal things, as well as some kind of environmental and contextual things.
Yeah, some great advice there, David. And I think tees us up quite nicely, actually, because that obviously is the things you need to be able to do this. And that resilience point, I think, is so important. And, I've heard it time and time again, and I'm sure, you felt this, and we'll come on to it, that particularly if you go from a big known brand to a smaller challenger brand, actually, that can become even more acute because you don't have the sort of badge behind you or, on your chest to carry you through. But from our conversations, I know, as you said about building the business in Australia for EY, like the same challenges exist. They're just variations on that theme. And maybe to that point, I'd love to, and this is a big question I appreciate, so I'll let you sort of chop it as small as you want, is I'd love to almost understand how you approached, in each of those cases, building that brand. You went off to Australia with your family, your suitcases, and started on day one with nothing. And to your point, I think Baringa had that sort of insurance practice that was going, but you went in to sort of build the L&P side. How did you approach in each of those situations building that brand? And almost what was it that in both cases was similar? And particularly for those two examples, what was it that was different when you were doing that first time at EY versus when you were doing that second time at Baringa?
Wow, there is a lot in there.
As I say, it's a biggie. I'll now sit back and let you take as much or as little of that as you want to bite off.
Yeah, no, happy to. And again, I might set some context here. So I think that might be the phrase of the morning, actually. So I'm going to set some context. But I think if you think of EY in Australia, EY is obviously one of the big four. It's a tremendously well-known brand everywhere. EY had a very large insurance client base. On the life and pension side in Sydney at the time, that was more audit-based. So Channel 1, as it's known in EY. Whereas on the GI side, there's really strong consulting business, but also tax and transactions and those types of things. So the client base was there. And if you think about the Australian market, and this was another consideration, Nick, I should have mentioned earlier, one of the things we thought about is, how are you going to get started in a new market? And the good thing with the insurance market in Australia is, even though there are lots and lots of players and lots of people have insurance licenses, actually the markets are semi-oligopolistic. And what I mean by that is there's a handful of very large players, and equally then quite a long tail. So you need to be
You're
quite
taking me back
thoughtful.
to my economics degree there, David.
Yeah, I think it's one of those, you just need to be quite thoughtful about that, because if you're going to build a business, it's going to be typically some of those larger players. But equally, there's a lot of international players who have a presence in the Australian marketplace. So that was one piece to particularly think about. In terms of building the business then, whilst I say EY had a brand, what they weren't known for was business transformation and operational transformation in particular. So the question is, how do you stretch the brand into those different capabilities? And one of the ways we did that quite early doors was we actually did an industry survey. So it's completely free to participate, obviously. And the ask of clients was, look, if you participate in this survey, of course, we'll share a benchmark report back with you and have a tailored conversation with you about what you might want to do with this. And we did this survey, I think, across 25, 30 large insurance players in Australia with their FDs and in some cases their CEOs. And we produced, really great glossy report off the back of that. It was really tangible and practical in advice. And the whole context for this was around lots of clients or lots of companies are claiming success with cost efficiency. Yet when you look at their forward projections and their plans, they're looking to double the amount of cost efficiency they've delivered in the next 5 years, in the previous 5 years, if that makes sense. And why is that? And what's the driver for that? And how are you going to actually make that next step? Because all the easy stuff's kind of done. And so that was a really thoughtful piece of knowledge leadership, which immediately created our brand with a range of clients. And that included audit clients who we couldn't actually do any consulting work with. But equally, they wanted to learn from the other players in terms of what was working well. We didn't, of course, broach any confidentialities, and everyone knew exactly how it was going to work. And it was all very open in terms of the rules of the game, if you like. But that created a huge brand presence. And then off the back of that, we had follow-up meetings with a range of clients. And then we had some proposals which came off that. And then we had some work that came off the back of that. And then that work led to further work. And it's just one of those kind of really, I guess, success builds success, or, success builds momentum, doesn't it? It's and if you get into that kind of successful loop in growing a startup, then that happens. Baringa was a different case, just to round out your question. Whereas, as I say, Baringa had fantastic brand at the time in many parts of particularly the energy sector, where it's ranked, I believe, by the FT as the #1 consultancy in that sector, and also in many parts of the financial services sector, particularly banking and broader insurance. They just hadn't done as much work at that point in time in the life and pension sector. And so that was a slightly different challenge where you couldn't leverage the EY brand, if you like, because it was unknown. It was more about how do you really start up. So that became more about personal networks, personal connections, and how do you start to have those conversations through your personal network to then introduce the consulting brand. And then from that, actually you can take those conversations again to that next level. So that was it's a different, as you said in the tee up, it was a different challenge, but both were brand stretches, just brand stretches in different ways with different assets to leverage and different challenges to work through.
I think, David, you did phenomenally well in answering succinctly what was a very large question. So thank you very much for that. And I think some really interesting points within there, particularly around the way the approaches differed and that point around the sort of the thought leadership, that knowledge leadership piece on the EY side and how effective that had been. As someone who now focuses on consulting marketing, I'd always recommend anyone does that. But I'm sort of being slightly biased there given what I do now for a profession. But I think, that point around the different focuses was really important. And I'm interested, again, and this may be really practical, but I think another thing that I've heard others say and sort of from my network is that point around, like you say, if you go into a brand like EY, it's got such good brand recognition. I'm not saying it's easy because I know it's not, but that can get you through a door at some points. I'm the partner at EY, can carry a lot of weight. Whereas when you're going to a more boutique firm, particularly in an industry which doesn't know it as well, that boutique name doesn't always carry as much, I guess, doesn't get you in the door as easily. And to your point around that personal network, you're getting really practical. What were some of those first phone calls? How did you get some of those people to say, actually, David, I've not heard of this Baringa company, but I'll have a chat with you. What, for anyone listening who's in that position, what were the steps that you used to get through those early doors?
I think some of the things that really worked was clearly I'd had the benefit of working with Accenture. And lots of my colleagues at Accenture had either gone on to other consultancies and or industry. So there's kind of that network here in the UK. I'd also worked with a host of people at Lloyd's, both in the general insurance side of the business and the life and pension side of the business, who'd gone on to other things. And those first interventions were very much reaching out to my extended network just to ask for that coffee for a catch-up. Just to say, actually, I've been gone for 3 years in Australia. I've done some really interesting things. I see you've gone on to do some really fabulous stuff in your career. Love to just connect for a coffee just to catch up and see how you're going. And it was more of that kind of very personal connection, which then gives the opportunity, of course, in the introductory email, you'd say, I've joined a new exciting firm and love to tell you a little bit more about it. But it gives you that opportunity just to have that client conversation. I think when you're growing a business and you're in a startup situation, you just can't have too many client conversations. And it really is the hard yards of wearing out shoe leather and making sure you connect with as many people who are good connections. And don't always think about, I have to jump to this person here because they're in this senior level and they're the economic buyer. And don't always think about that sales methodology. Think about actually who are the people I know, I trust, I respect, who are doing some interesting things. And it's a two-way thing, because some of those people had been my mentees in the past, and we picked up some of those conversations again. Some of those people wanted to learn about consulting and wanted to actually find out a bit more. Some people were intrigued in the personal side of the story. So it wasn't fake or false or anything like that. It was just an opportunity to reconnect with a group of people. And from those connections, again, success builds success. If you come back to momentum, good things happen, because they start to connect you with other people. They're like, oh, well, Baringa does some really interesting work in this particular place. So can we introduce you to this person, because they might be interested in some of the stuff you've done? And, oh, I've heard that energy's a little bit more advanced in this particular area. Could we perhaps find out a bit more about what you've been doing in that sector? So all of these conversations just lead to another conversation. And then eventually you kind of work through the jigsaw, and you connect back to the economic buyer somehow. But at least when you do, you've actually got the context, you've got the organizational dynamics, you understand more about what the priorities are, you understand more about where there's investment, you understand some of those very practical considerations that actually are important when it comes to actually ultimately perhaps having your first proposal and your first project.
I think it's a bit like the point you made around careers, that breadth, and almost, not trying to hit a home run on the first at bat, or whatever the sports metaphor you choose to use is. That point around actually broadening your net. And I think, you touched on a subtle but again critical point that I sometimes think we can lose sight of in consulting, or just, work at large, when you're thinking I need to sell work, for instance, is you go straight in with the transactional conversation of, David, can I sell you something, or can you tell me how I can, work with you? And actually that personal angle of just having a conversation, sharing something that's a bit of a break from work, your experience of travel, etc., I think it's always a much nicer way to start a conversation. And like you say, actually, a lot of these people, it's just that connection. But if you do that enough, before you know it, you've got 20 conversations, and some of those lead to new business. I think some subtle but really powerful advice for anyone listening, David. And like you said on career, it's kind of, don't get too blinkered. If you just think I'm only going to talk to the CEO, it's quite a binary way to the top. Whereas it's something I find in our business today. I speak to a lot of consultants who say, we work with CEOs, we work with CFOs. As well as I do, particularly in organizations like LBG, where you worked, there's so many buyers below that who may be like 2 or 3 or 4 levels down from the board, but actually having those conversations, those connections can be equally powerful. So yeah, I think some really, really good advice in there. And I think, David, we're sadly coming to the end of our time together. And I know you've teed me up for quite a few of these points in your, in the conversation today. And you mentioned around books, and I know you've listened to a few of these conversations before, so I suspect you know what's coming here. And these are 2 questions that I ask every one of my guests, because I really love to get the similarities of these answers, but also the differences and unique elements of people's journeys. And the first one is books, and it might be the 2 you've touched on, but I always like to find out, what are the book or books that you find yourself recommending or gifting to people most often, and why is that?
So I think possibly the first one, Nick, and I think there's a couple, if that's okay.
Yeah, the more the merrier.
What we've talked about today, and we haven't maybe mentioned the T word yet, really, but we've touched a lot on transitions and moving from consulting to industry, moving from industry back to consulting, moving to different geographies, moving between firms, and it's managing those transitions is really quite a key skill, and we perhaps haven't drawn it out. So the first book I'll talk about is one called The First 90 Days by Michael Watkins. And what this book does is it gives, again, a very practical, pragmatic way of thinking through the different dimensions of a transition to a new role, or indeed a new company or a new geography. And what are some of the watch outs? Because when you're the new shiny thing, there's obviously that slight halo effect, but equally you're perhaps most vulnerable at that point in your career, because you don't have the network yet, you don't have the internal track record, you don't have the relationships, you don't have the friendships, you don't have many of the things which people rely on in their careers. So the book is just a really practical, insightful book that helps guide you through that. But I think the other one I'd probably refer back to, which is one that was really useful early in those early Lloyd's days, is a book called Why Should Anyone Be Led by You by Rob Goffey and Gareth Jones. And I think I mentioned that probably one of the biggest learnings is around self-awareness, and then using that self-awareness to become a more effective leader. And I think this book is just great in terms of actually how do you connect with your real authentic self, your real authentic leader, and then how do you do that in a way that starts to create followership in the different facets of your role. So I think that's equally a really good book. And then lastly, perhaps the last one I'd recommend is perhaps slightly off-piste, but it's actually The Art of Happiness by the Dalai Lama, which is just a fascinating, beautiful read. And I think one of the concepts he talks about in there, although there are many, is the difference between absolute happiness and comparative happiness. And unfortunately, in the West in particular, we tend to judge happiness in comparative terms perhaps far too much, whereas actually the purpose of life is to find absolute happiness. And what I mean by that is, you might go on a great holiday with your friends, have a fabulous and family, have a fabulous time, have a great experience, and think, wow, that's a perfect holiday. But then when you flick on Facebook or Instagram or whatever else, or other social media, you see what everyone else is doing, and suddenly you don't think, oh, well, perhaps I wasn't quite as happy because look at what these people are doing. And I think that's a real risk in life, is that you spend so long comparing to everyone else and looking for comparative happiness that you don't actually find what makes you happy. Some of the things which are most important. Like for me, it's my family, it's being a good husband, it's being a good father, it's having a great family unit, it's our great friends. And it's trying my best to help and add value to the clients and or organizations I work for every single day, and trying to just make a difference and a positive impact on the world. So I think it's just great learning in that sense.
I think it's a great recommendation, David. I read too many business books, but I love recommendations like that are from outside of business, particularly in our industry, because I think it can be very easy to get trapped in the cycle of comparative happiness. You always look at the next pay rise or the next promotion, and it can be very easy to get lost in that and not actually sort of take that step back. And I mean, I don't always open this question up, but I'd just love to find out anything else on that topic that's really helped you. Was it just that book that really sort of opened your mind to it and, your thought process, or how did you get yourself on that journey to, towards that absolute happiness, as opposed to, always comparing it to, like you say, your friend's holiday on Instagram or, your friend's new car on Facebook or wherever these things are?
Yeah, well, I'm certainly not the Dalai Lama, and certainly I certainly haven't reached inner fulfillment quite yet. But I think I just refer back to it the whole time, Nick, in terms of, I think the question you need to ask yourself is, will it really make me and the people who are closest to me happy? And I think promotions in consulting firms is a great one, because you see people who are almost desperate to make this level, and there might be a whole range of reasons why they're desperate to make that level. Typically, it's actually not money. Typically, it's about status and keeping up with everyone else and wanting to strive to be the best and those types of things. But actually, you need to ask yourself, will it make me happy, and will it take me on the journey to where I want to get to? And will it make the people around me happy, or will the sacrifices, frankly, just not be worth it? And, that's particularly true at the partnership level, actually, when you're coaching people who are thinking about going for partner. You really do need to think about it's a big undertaking in any firm. Are you prepared for, yes, of course, the brilliant things that come with partnership and all of the great things that come from that, but equally some of the choices and consequences of taking on, one of those types of roles. So I think it's a great leveler to ask that simple question. In absolute terms, will this make you and the people close to you happy, as opposed to just comparing to the Joneses, as you say?
It's, I think, a critical point, David. And it was actually one of my previous guests. They described that juncture as a burger eating contest where the prize is more burgers. And I think, so often, and I say this having never got there, so this may be nonsense, but I think it can be very easy to look at partners and hear about partners as if, it's almost like a plane going through the sky. You go through the sort of the rain and the clouds and you get up into this, this lauded space. And I think, to your point, time and again, I just hear people say, well, it's the same job. It's different. Obviously, there's more challenges, complexities. But to your point, you've got to make sure you enjoy doing the thing you're doing, because that's what will make you happy. Actually, just the title of partner or, like you say, the status will be there for a little while, but just like a new car, it eventually gets old and doesn't keep that happiness. So I think, profound points and really powerful and yeah, critical. And we didn't touch on them, but the first book's equally, I think, really interesting. And that point around transition is not lost on me, and that how you navigate that's critical. So those two books. I love the title of the Why Should Anyone Be Led by You? I think that's a great title for a book. Did you find an answer by the end of it, or was it like the Dalai Lama, you're still searching for that answer?
I think in terms of leadership, you learn more about yourself every day, don't you? And you get better and better if you work at it, like anything in life. So yeah, it certainly gave me lots of food for thought, and certainly learned lots from it. But equally, I don't think any of us are perfect. Oh, we were always kind of imperfect versions of ourselves, working hopefully to get better.
And I think, David, that takes us very nicely on to the last question for today. And this, again, we touched on some elements there around your advice. And this is really a chance to recap that and give advice to people at different stages of their career. So the question is, you've got three people in front of you. One is at that analyst level, if we use sort of Baringa or Accenture or EY parlance, they're that analyst just coming into the industry. The second is someone who's at that manager grade. So, they're in the middle of that sort of that first part of their career. And then the final person is, you touched on them actually, someone who's approaching partners. They're a director who, is looking at, do I make partner? Do I do something else? To that point around it being a commitment, what do I do? And the question is quite simply, what one piece of final advice would you give to each of them?
Wow. So just the one. Well, I'll try my best.
If there's more, feel free, David. What advice would you give to each of them?
Of course. So in terms of the one just starting up in their career in consulting, I think the piece of advice I'd give is just try and get as much broad experience and variety as you possibly can early in your career. And the reason I say that is all too often you see people join who have lots of preconceptions about the types of industries they want to work in, the types of roles they want to do, and equally where they don't want to work and what they don't want to do. And I think it doesn't really matter in your career because everything is a learning experience. And yes, of course, you'll get some fantastic experiences and you'll want to do more of those types of things. You may have some experiences which aren't perhaps quite as good and you'll perhaps learn from those, but it's all just rich learning. So just don't be too precious, don't be too dogmatic in your views, be open to as many experiences as you can. Because when I coach people at that kind of level, we often do a 2x2 matrix and we think about typical ex-consultant where we think about what are the things you've done that you either want to do again or frankly don't want to do, and what are the things you haven't done that you may want to do or you definitely don't want to do. And when you start plotting on there, the richer your experience, the more data points you've got in order to inform the future. So that's the first person. In terms of someone going 4 or 5 years in, I think the advice I'd possibly give is, how do you start to create that? I think you said T model earlier. So in other words, how are you going to balance specialism with some of those more general business skills? Because actually the best partners, and we'll come on to partners shortly, are the people, as we touched on earlier, who can probably hold a range of conversations but knows where to phone a friend. And perhaps some of those people who are a little bit too specialist or niche don't necessarily take those next steps on in the partnership. So I'd encourage people at that level to firstly focus on the T. Secondly, to think about, how do I get as much people management and leadership experience as I possibly can, and how do I learn to let go of some of those things that have made me successful, and how do I recruit people and grow people to be much better than I could ever be. So that would be the second piece of advice. And I think in terms of the person, thinking about partnership, there's probably two questions I'd probably pose to them, and I'd pose it more as questions rather than advice because everyone's different. I think the first is, what do you really want to be famous for? And the reason I pose that question is because actually the most effective partners, they may not have written it down or articulated, but the most effective partners at early levels and throughout their partnership have a bit of a vision, have a bit of thought about what does that exciting future look like and how I'm going to build a future that's more exciting than the past. So what do you want to be famous for? And then the second question is about the organization, just to say, are you sure you're in the right organization where you want to make that transition? And there's a lot of questions you can explore off the back of that around, the culture, the values, the way you work with your colleagues, in terms of, do you have the right challenge, the right support, the right inspiration, the right motivation, the right value sets? And I think that environment is super duper important as a partner to make sure that there's a real match there. So that would be the advice to the person thinking about that transition.
David, I think that is a fantastic place for us to close off today. I love the 2x2 for the junior consultants, and equally, I'm I think it's a great piece of advice for anyone. I know a lot of friends, and frankly still similar, not everyone knows exactly what they were put on the planet to do. And having a matrix like that where you're putting all of those different experience points frames it really well. Likewise, I think that partner advice and, your point around what do you want to be famous for? We didn't have a chance today to touch on, that personal branding and how you do that. But equally, like you say, is a really key part. So some great advice there, and I'm sure will be really useful for anyone listening. And the very last question is really just, David, a chance for anyone who's listened to this, they've really enjoyed it, they want to find out more about yourself, they want to find out more about Barnett Waddingham. Where would you point them to? Where can they get in touch?
Yeah, of course, Nick, and probably the best place is LinkedIn, if that's okay. So please do reach out. I do hope everyone's have enjoyed today's podcast, because as I said earlier, you've had some fantastic, super interesting and super inspirational guests on previously. So I hope I've done you and the podcast justice and given some useful hints and advice. But please do get in contact by LinkedIn. Love to connect and explore whatever you'd like to explore. So please do reach out.
Fantastic, David. Well, I'll put those details. So I'll put your LinkedIn profile. I also put the Barnett Waddingham website on the show notes so people can go and find it and find you. And to your point, I think thank you for coming on. It's really interesting to find out more about your story. There's a lot in there that I didn't know, and that's always, I like these interviews where I don't know what the outcome's going to be and where it's going to take us. So thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it. I know my listeners will have got a lot out of it as well. So thank you, and all that's left to say is all the best for the rest of your week.
Yeah, thank you, Nick, and all the best to you, and hope you all stay safe and well. That's the most important thing right now. Stay safe, but also thanks to your listeners for listening in, and thanks to you, Nick, for inviting me along today. I do hope it's been useful for people, and people have taken some useful advice away from it.
Fantastic, David. Thanks a lot. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Climbing Consulting. If you have any guest recommendations, comments, ideas, thoughts on how I can make this show better for you, just drop me an email. It's nick@createengage.co.uk, and I really look forward to hearing from you.